So it's great to be here with everyone. I haven't seen many of you in so long, so thank you for inviting me, Keith and Suzanne, and Adam. For those of you who know me, I've done a lot of work on scapegoating in the workplace, and considering what's going on today in our culture and what the topic of this conference was, I decided to play around with some new ideas to contextualize my more practical work on scapegoating in the workplace. So I feel like I'm going to echo a lot of what some of you have already said today, but bear with me, and we'll set up a kind of new context for the practical model I'll present later. So I'm calling my talk Post-Truth Narrative Confusion and Workplace Scapegoating. The cultural phenomenon of post-truth taking place is not only our national milieu these days, but is rampant in the microcosms of the workplace. The Raven Foundation states in their announcement for this conference that indeed today truth has fallen on hard times. It also suggests our transition into a post-truth world. The Oxford Dictionary defines post-truth as, I'm quoting, relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. I think that echoes a lot of what we talked about this morning, or earlier this afternoon. Amy Wang in the Washington Post elaborates on this definition when she writes, in this case, the post prefix doesn't mean after so much as it implies an atmosphere in which a notion is irrelevant. Wang further states in her piece that objective facts are of secondary, if any, importance in the post-truth context. What gains support are affective devices, the appeal to emotions, and personal conviction. To clarify the phenomenon even further, I might rephrase this idea of post-truth as a kind of contest of narratives. Whose story is more convincing? We all know that narratives are powerful makers of truth. Once we spin a narrative, we can enroll others into looking for the evidence to corroborate it. And because people are then looking for this evidence, they usually find it. We also find that narrative truth sometimes wins out even when challenged by facts. I think most readily of Trump's, sorry to bring up Trump again, but Trump's post-truth claim that the turnout at his inauguration was the largest turnout in history. In these side-by-side images, we see Trump's 2017 inauguration crowd and Obama's 2009 inauguration, the great volume symbol on my screenshot. My guess is you've all seen these images before too, correct? Kellyanne Conway called Trump's largest turnout a so-called post-truth claim herself, using the phrase alternative facts when challenged with data from the transit authorities as well as these photos. Many people got very worked up over these remarks. At least the media did. We cannot, however, really assess her statement properly at all if we assume it has anything to do with the realm of truth, though, as we know it. Her statement is not at all about the truth, but about post-truth. It's about generating the winning narrative. And one of the primary means of competing for narrative control is through generating what I call narrative confusion. Fake news is part of this phenomenon. While this graph shows one mention of fake news from about 2015, and certainly our world is not new to propaganda and other such so-called attempts at bias reporting, but the distinguishing and public labeling of some news as fake contributes to narrative confusion and is part of the attempt at narrative control. This chart scraped the 6 different news media stations shown at the bottom to show the number of times fake news has been, the words fake news have been used over this timeline. So it really just occurred after the election. We never talked about fake news before at all. So it has been labeled very recently. Now, in speaking with Stephen in preparation for the event, Stephen mentioned this idea of a narrative as a mimetic object and the attempt to control narrative as a source of mimetic rivalry. So thank you for this insight. If we can understand what's happening in our media through this Girardian lens, we may no longer try to look for truth at all, but only for which competitor is currently casting the most doubt in our minds about truth, and thereby winning control of the narrative. Stories, narratives, as we know, I study religion, and this is certainly true in my discipline. Narratives are usually truer than true. We all have narratives to tell of our experience, and I think we probably believe certain stories based on our experience, independent sometimes of so-called facts to the contrary. So I'm relieved in some sense that the phenomenon of fake news or narrative control is getting public attention. Bringing these distinctions into the public conversation may make the process of mimetic rivalry and violent scapegoating clear in the public eye as well. A good part of my work as a researcher and consultant has been on how mimetic rivalry and scapegoating play out in the workplace. The workplace atmosphere in the midst of an organizational scapegoating is typically one in which truth is impossible to discern, and post-truth attempts at narrative control prevail. For example, when the scapegoating process is in play, the model for which I'll lay out in a moment, the process causes the targeted individual severe confusion or cognitive dissonance, particularly, for example, due to having a narrative fed to them that constantly defies their experience. This leads to extreme stress, often resulting in lasting health issues, even and eventually often PTSD and suicide. It's certainly a post-truth game, where confusion is generated and trust becomes impossible. To follow up on what Stephen laid out very well about scandal, the rabbis knew that such scandal could only be answered by the fear of God, when no one knows really what anyone's intentions are. It was through personal friendships with several brilliant and kind human beings that became scapegoated targets that I saw the vast hole in understanding of how this process plays out in organizations. And it was through Girard's insights that I found a means for understanding and distinguishing this process. So I'm going to walk through my model now of how mimetic desire, rivalry, and scapegoating play out in a workplace situation. And I'd like to keep these ideas of the subjugation of truth for post-truth, the control of the narrative as mimetic object, and scandal as loss of trust, as beneath the surface of the practical manifestations of the scapegoating process. Okay? And of course, before I actually show you the scapegoating process, we're going to define a few terms. So, because I do this in organizations and people in our culture generally are familiar with at least the term bullying. I wrote this in one article for counselors on scapegoating, that in the U.S. workplace, scapegoating is actually typically lumped in with the phenomenon of bullying, if scapegoating is talked about at all, actually. And lumping scapegoating in with bullying is misleading and prevents people from finding a solution to a different problem. So workplace bullying is often defined here by two of the so-called bullying experts in the country, Gary and Ruth Namey. They define workplace bullying as repeated health-harming mistreatment of one or more persons, the targets, by one or more perpetrators that takes one or more of the following forms: verbal abuse, offensive conduct behaviors, including nonverbal, which are threatening, humiliating, or intimidating, or work interference, sabotage, which prevents work from getting done. Pretty broad. One or more of, with one or more of, and one or more of. So bullying tends to encompass such a huge spectrum of ambiguous behavior that I know we've made a lot of progress in it, but it's a pretty tough thing to actually manage in a workplace situation. A typical aspect of bullying also is that the bully relies on the target to be around to receive the mistreatment. It's kind of a power dynamic that you're talking about in bullying. Unlike in scapegoating, in bullying there is no goal of expulsion of the target. There's no attempts at expulsion discerned in any definitions of bullying or reports of bullying. Additionally, bullying is not typically seen as a systemic issue, but typically a problem of an individual or group. So to pinpoint just one danger of conflating scapegoating with bullying, research shows that the scapegoated suffering target is commonly mislabeled a bully if they display any sign of anger or negative emotion. This creates further emotional distress for the target, also deflecting attention away from the real cause of violence. Anti-bullying laws can lamentably aid and abet a scapegoating in this way. The second term I want to define is a term called mobbing, which is another term used to describe workplace abuse that is a little bit misleading, but it's very close to what we understand as scapegoating. This term was first coined by Dr. Konrad Lorenz in his book called On Aggression in 1966. And it was later adopted by Dr. Heinz Lehmann, a Swedish psychologist. The term mobbing is sometimes used in Europe and Australia, much less frequently in the United States. And it's used to describe what looks something like group or organizational bullying, essentially. A Canadian sociologist named Dr. Kenneth Westhughes has also written extensively on mobbing in academia. Mobbing is defined by Westhughes as well as the International Labor Organization as such. The mobbing syndrome is a malicious attempt to force a person out of the workplace through unjustified accusations, humiliation, general harassment, emotional abuse, and/or terror. It is a ganging up by the leaders, organization, superior, coworker, or subordinate, who rallies others into systemic and frequent mob-like behavior. Pretty close. So Lawrence originally used the term to describe the behavior of birds. Certain species of birds will literally, in the German, put a hate on, or mob, around a potentially dangerous predator in order to protect their offspring. Bird mobbing may also be a type of behavior to assert dominance. Lawrence indicated in his research that humans have the same mobbing instincts as birds, and Lehman followed this idea in adopting the term to write about workplace abuse. Lawrence also acknowledged the part that culture plays as a control or channel for human mobbing instincts. But mobbing work case studies demonstrate that humans, unlike birds, are subtle and manipulative in their violence, avoiding obvious mobbing gestures. Human mobbing is also much slower and way more complex than what birds do. So mobbing, like bullying, importantly fails to offer any insight into the causal path of the workplace abuse. Mobbing never answers why this behavior is happening in human contexts, why an expulsion is sought. It does not simply boil down to protection or dominance. Girard's scapegoating mechanism does seem to offer deeper insights. Mimetic rivalry and the scapegoat mechanism address together the why and the how, in my view. The crisis that begets rivalry, the post-truth mimetic attempts to control narratives, and the scandal of narrative confusion that sets up the eventual expulsion of the target. I see the scapegoating mechanism as enabling us to importantly understand workplace systems in terms of the specific capacities and complexities of human nature. So quickly to then define scapegoating, this is my working definition. It's quite long, but I think it kind of encapsulates the process. Scapegoating is the process of destructive rivalry that leads to the abuse, isolation, and expulsion of an individual that has become targeted in the workplace. It entails undue blame being put on the target as cause of a real or perceived crisis, such that this person becomes the center of escalating hostile attention. The eventual expulsion of the blamed target, whether by resignation or termination, achieves temporary social or group cohesion, and in many cases a fragile sense of relief and return to the status quo. So one of the tailgate signs of scapegoating is that there's no discernible conflict between the persecutors and persecuting organization and the target that could work toward resolution. It's not about conflict at all. It's not about resolving conflict. Resolution is not the goal. The target is more like a sacrifice made with the romantic hope of relieving a community crisis. And this goes for workplace situations as others, as Gerard had noticed. The odd and characteristic goal of scapegoating is expulsion. So the target is made out to be like a disease that needs to be purged. Following Gerard's basic blueprint, the scapegoat mechanism to me seems to follow 6 basic steps. So here we'll go through this model. And here are the 6 steps here. The first step is that there's a crisis that threatens the status quo. Aggressive rivalry, the target emerges. Critical mass is the 4th stage, isolation the 5th, and expulsion the 6th. And I'll walk through each of these very briefly now. So stage 1 is the status quo and crisis. This is the advent of the real or perceived workplace crisis. In other words, something happens or is changing that poses a threat to the status quo. There may be a change in management. There may be the possibility of promotion or demotion. Perhaps the organization is considering budget cuts. Perhaps someone is put into a leadership position without the appropriate experience or qualifications. It could be a number of different issues. But in many cases, the change in threat to the status quo is real. In some cases, it's a perceived crisis, which is the trigger. So if a manager or team is given a project where they think they might fail, their own imagined crisis may begin the cycle as well. Stage 2 is aggressive rivalry. So stage 2 involves the development of aggressive rivalry between teams or individuals. The real or perceived threat present in stage 1 now creates an atmosphere of survival. This phase is one of increasing rivalry and sameness, whereas before everyone was secure in their distinct role, now lines between roles are blurred. For example, perhaps people may be asked to pitch in on non-job specific tasks. Microaggressions, like asking people to engage in work below their job level, or frequent interruptions will be present, even frequent. Other characteristics of this phase include high pressure to produce work, setting of impossible deadlines, fear, gossip, stress, and everyone being out for themselves. In this developing pressurized system, people are engaging in rivalry with others, overt or covert for survival, and all mirror each other's survival instincts. Confusion just begins to set in here related to job roles. Gossip sets in as a way of competing for the winning narrative, and trust decreases as others' intentions cannot be clearly determined. Stage 3, the target emerges. Stage 3 involves the emergence and identification of the target. The level of sameness from stage 2 creates greater and greater feelings of unrest and confusion. People's identities feel threatened. Their work functions seem less clear. They may feel their role at work is unimportant or unnecessary. As rivalry among an entire workforce is inherently unsustainable, rivalry now shifts to an individual target upon whom blame is placed for the crisis. The process of dehumanizing the target now begins, and the intensifying objectification enables violence to escalate. Characteristics of this phase include unjustified and persistent criticism, monitoring of the target's work, public criticism or humiliation, attacks on reputation and social relations, and confusion for the target. Confusion here sets in specifically for the target, which may include many different aspects. For example, alternative narratives to the target's experience. For example, summarizing a meeting for the record in a way that disagrees with the target's experience, leaving out important information for the target, assigning the target ample and unnecessary work, etc. The alternative narrative building against the target's experience is deeply unsettling, and paranoia, rightly, may begin to set in for them. Stage 4 is critical mass. In this stage, one will see group escalation as more and more people gather against the target. The sameness of individual vulnerability that characterized stage 2 now shifts to alliance with the dominant group and a feeling of power against the target. There will be a feeling of mounting peer pressure to engage in, or at least witness, the violence against the target. There may be bystander participation as well. This phase has an all-against-one characteristic. The target is now a liminal figure set up for the scapegoating. The target is still working for the organization, but is also being rejected by the organization. The target has a job function, but their function is being manipulated. The target's role is blurred, solidifying their dehumanization and making them an acceptable receiver of blame. Management often gets involved at this stage, either through pressure from above or through misjudgment of the situation, and exacerbates the target's plight. Typically going to HR works against you. The experience of, this is unbelievable, I'm sorry to end on such a dour note, but it's actually, in all the cases I've read on this, there's not a vast amount of literature, but the cases all fall into these same patterns. It is really quite unbelievable. The experience of this stage is typified as one of continual psychological assaults, including lengthy and multiple investigations on the target into anonymous and very trivial complaints. So the targets often describe this stage as a kind of witch hunt on them. The target in this stage is very often subject to procedures that are being used to confirm the alternative narrative against them. They are essentially set up to fail. Evidence is generated to substantiate the alternative narrative. At stage 5, it's isolation. The escalating dehumanization of the target causes the target to undergo severe distress, which manifests in health issues, poor work performance, and psychological issues. Misjudgment by management and colleagues reinforces the negative cycle and trauma on the target. The target's suffering behavior is now taken as proof, confirming the alternative narrative that the organization has put forth. In this stage, the target thus becomes branded as difficult, incompetent, and even mentally ill. The organization continues to inflict destabilizing influences, which may include withholding information, freezing out, ignoring or excluding, shifting of goalposts without telling the target, constant undervaluing of the target's efforts, unreasonable refusal of applications for leave, training, etc., and the removal of areas of responsibility without consultation. The target has lost the narrative competition. The alternative narrative is now corroborated by the responses and reactions the target is seen to have exhibited, and further evidence comes from confusing and demanding work expectations that the target may fail to meet. Stage 6 is expulsion. In this stage, the target leaves the organization, either voluntarily or by forced resignation or termination. The trauma of the entire cycle culminating in this event can trigger or exacerbate, as I mentioned, PTSD and other disorders. Financial pressures also mount with job loss. Emotional distress and illness often intensifies, sometimes resulting in suicide. The target has successfully been blamed for the crisis, and the organization is left with a sense of relief, a kind of return to order that will continue until the process restarts. In some cases, the violence continues even after the expulsion. The organization may denigrate the target to future employers or social networks to publicly affirm the alternative narrative they put forth, and to justify the expulsion and organization's actions leading up to it. Scapegoating in the workplace, in light of this practical model, clearly begins and grows inside of an ambiguous atmosphere, an atmosphere in which great loss or great reward is at stake. In this balance between perceived life and death, really, certainty erodes and alternative narratives swirl in a kind of soup, everyone out for themselves, rivals yearning for control of the truth. The scapegoated target becomes a victim of those who ultimately attain narrative control, the post-truth narrative born out of crisis. and the target, sadly, and despite their best efforts, may be unable to escape the narrative into which they have been written. So, I have a very uplifting case study. If you would like to take a look. Sure, you want to hand it out on that side? Thank you. This is a case from Kenneth Westhue's book. If you would pass those out, please. And we can't, give one that would show all of the details of what happened in this situation, but you can get the basic summary of it. Pass those down.
There's more here.
Once you finish, I'll ask you to we have a few minutes, talk to the people at your table or the person next to you if that's easier, and just discuss these questions for a few minutes, and then we'll debrief with the group.
Jeez. This happened last year. Oh, really? Last year was my complaint. But I had no idea about it. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, they keep saying that around. Yeah. Well, that's ghastly. It seems, yeah, I think that what you were saying that the fact that it was made public too seems to be really, yeah. Even to that point. My father was forced out of the company when they brought in a new CEO. They brought in a new CEO, and the new CEO just decided we don't need our own legal department, so we're going to outsource all the legal work to a firm. But he didn't want people in the company who knew where bodies were buried, who knew too much institutional history. These are always dangerous to know people. And he made this announcement in an executive meeting of their executive board. He didn't know that my father was a general counsel. He didn't know that my father was also an executive vice president. So he was at the board meeting, and this new CEO announced that we'll be getting rid of the law department. My dad, like, he just felt like the floor opened up under him. And yeah, they just terminated him. But you know, he hired a good law firm. And he got a good result out of it. You know, I mean, he got a real golden parachute. But the wound and the post-traumatic stress, I mean, it was 4 years probably of total hell, you know. Yeah, because he brought a lawsuit back against the company and all this, you know, he sued them for damages. It's the Marriott Corporation, run by Mormons. You would have thought, like, the most ethical of all businesses, you know.
You never know.
And, yeah.
They're so, legal system is...
This is great too. I may use this line if I talk during it, but in our university, the point that you made that it's not about the conflict. The conflict is just the occasion, but actually, often the occasion is one that you can't deal with. I mean, an economic crisis can be almost like the weather, you know. Like the storm in Jonah, you know, and I figure we can't deal with this, but we got to do something. So it's actually a way of not dealing with real problems. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. It's a total distraction.
Yeah. Distraction. Yeah, that's what scandal is too.
Yeah.
It's distraction.
Yeah, everything I wrote down some notes actually. That was really helpful. Better get people to
yeah. Before they go out and pour a glass of wine.
Okay.
I missed the uplifting.
Oh, darn, we forgot to do the uplifting part.
Feel good part.
No, there's wine and cheese after this.
There's wine and cheese. Thank you.
That's anesthetic.
Yes, the wine and cheese is coming. Well, the uplifting part is that at least people are talking about this now, and it's not completely under wraps. But the organizations don't really want to talk about this. I mean, it's kind of a hard sell for a seminar. You know, hey, let's talk about your scapegoating. It's not exactly, you know, another company's scapegoating. Exactly.
Well, you know, the fact is, I'm reminded of a New Yorker cartoon not too long ago where in an office environment, this rather tall man is saying to a rather shorter man, I want to thank you for being our scapegoat. But of course, that's not possible because the scapegoater doesn't see him, her doing that. But I just want to ask you, I was going to ask you, Vanessa, where does scandal kick in? And I realized you've done it, because on the fourth paragraph regarding the intervention of the media, research or discipline by McGill Breaking News. That is to say, aha, these researchers, they're not so smart. If we can take them down, I mean, they have a lab and a chair, and all we have is a pen, a paper, and a microphone. And so the fact is the media loves it when you can take down some presumed source of knowledge. Ann and I were comparing notes about the fact that back in the day we talked about journalism and tabloids. We talked about news and scandal sheets. And this is a recent case. That difference is evaporated. But for me, the role where scandal kicks in is when the media gets a piece of it. You know, the university will adjudicate that, and she might have survived that adjudication. But then when you've got a team of reporters following you around, you know, and photographing your house, and the pressure just builds up, and the pressure is mimetic. I mean, it builds and builds and builds, because a journalist's bread and butter is playing the scandal for absolutely everything he or she can, regardless of any foundation at all.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. The bringing down of the great researchers,
Well,
and especially at McGill, which dominates Montreal as the great research institution. One of the two in Canada. And you're absolutely right. I hadn't thought about scandal coming into this case that way, but I do think that's true.
It's Schadenfreude, the how low the mighty have fallen kind of thing. Yeah. Non-academic, non-research public are very tempted, by this takedown, because, okay, they're not so smart, which means I'm not so stupid.
And in academic conflicts, everyone knows this one. Academic conflicts are so vicious because the stakes are so low.
That's right. That's right.
May I ask? It says she appealed to an arbitrator. Now, before this could be heard, there was a report in the press. This is something that happens a great deal. Was there no arbitration? Did it not go ahead at all?
I don't think it did.
Because, headlines in the press, we all know that's hocus pocus. And any good arbitrator would have said, you put this aside. You do not ignore totally anything that's written in the press. You only listen to what you hear here. I mean, any court of law arbitration. But it doesn't tell us if there was any arbitration. She wrote a letter, which probably didn't help her very much. So we don't know if there was any arbitration.
I don't think there was in this case. I think I forget if West Hughes puts more detail in his book. He doesn't always give the full explanation, so we have to infer certain things from, well, what kind of harassment is she talking about that took place beforehand? But it doesn't look like arbitration did take place because the case was actually closed eventually. So nothing really got done through the legal system at all. And it is that point where the media took the narrative, the alternative narrative the organization was creating, where her case was lost. And I've seen this happen in other cases as well, where once the media actually breaks the story, then the target tries to go to the media to give their alternative point of view. It just doesn't work. The media won't even provide the alternative or the truth. If it is the truth, sometimes the truth actually is fuzzy here. Often the scapegoat does stand out in some way, and that's why they become the scapegoat. Either they're very hardworking, they're very successful, and usually they are, actually. Even more why when they're taken down. They're taken down.
Yeah, just for clarity's sake, the article says before the case could be heard, the article in the Montreal Gazette appeared. That was on April 9th, and the suicide happened on April 12th. Mm. So the arbitration couldn't have happened in the interim.
Thank you. Yeah, it was public humiliation. It was for this researcher. It was absolute public humiliation. I think she just saw her. There are targets who go on and have successful careers afterwards, but for her, it clearly just was too devastating.
I would like to stand and ask forgiveness. I've done this. Didn't end in death. But I sat in on the meetings where we figured out who the bad guy in the company was. I responded to, yeah, that's right. He's the one who's messing this up. If we could just get rid of that guy. I have done this. And while I was doing it, I felt absolutely and completely justified. Look how much better the company will be. He's probably stealing stuff as well. I participated in it, and I congratulated all the rest of us who were so wise that we saw that if we could just get rid of that guy, things would be better. I did this.
We all do.
And I'm trying to learn to do better, and I'm grateful for the insight. But as I read this thing, and I'm so grateful that The irony is that the guy that we got out went on to be profoundly successful and way better than he ever was at our company. We were all pissed off. But it is painful and almost liberating to recognize. And I'm trying to learn to do better.
I like the point that, well, first of all, this pretty much describes something I've seen happen in my own university, but I really like the point that when you first said the scapegoating is not about the conflict, I thought, well, of course it's about the conflict, but that's actually a brilliant point. The conflict, especially the ones that hit businesses and organizations, they often are treated like, it could be an economic problem, but it seems like the weather. I said to Vanessa, she wrote the definitive piece on the book of Jonah, and the storm is the conflict, or it occasions the conflict, but there's nothing to be done about the storm. Mm-hmm. And this is what happens in organizations I've seen in my university, where there's a problem, and they don't know how to fix the problem, and they've already paid a lot of consultants to tell them what they already knew, which is that they didn't know how to fix the problem. So then they go on a witch hunt, and then this process, and it's actually a way of not solving conflict. It's anti-conflict resolution.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you.
Exactly.
Vanessa, when you were going through the different steps, and you had first the crisis, and then the intensive rivalry before the identification of the target, I wasn't clear what the relationship between step 2 and step 3 was. I mean, do the rivals themselves unite against a target, or is one of the rivals a target, or could both cases be, in this story you told here, there's a lot of anonymity, so there's a backstory, right? So there's this complaint from somebody, from who, and then the anonymous letter, and then the victim saying, well, yeah, that there was harassment going on, before this newspaper article was published. And so there's clearly an escalation that's gone on prior to this event. But I was wondering if you could clarify, how does it go from a rivalry between like two guys, excuse me, two players in the company who want to sort of take things in hand to resolve the crisis, right? Mm-hmm. Find a way out of it. And that spreads, right, as you got two rivals. But how, it seems like it has to be clear how you go from that competition, to the selection of a scapegoat.
Yeah, I agree. It would be great if it could be clear, but the model, I think, has to be ambiguous because it looks different depending on the context. So sometimes you would have, let's say you have, what year was it? I don't know, Lehman Brothers was about to, fold, getting rid of entire departments, and so there were a lot of budget cuts and layoffs that were happening. So I was temping at Lehman Brothers way back when, and I was there while these layoffs were happening, the first of many. And so you had an enormous room, probably of 100 people, who were sitting there waiting to be next, and so that's an atmosphere in which high pressure, everyone becomes out for themselves. That's a situation where you have a kind of rivalry between the people because only a handful were going to keep their seats. But in other cases, you will have a rivalry really just between two people that heats up until one of them loses narrative control and they become the target. So it does look different depending on the situation, but so it has to stay ambiguous, I think, unfortunately, just to be able to plug in different situations. Yeah, and again, I should go back and look at details, because you can find some stuff in the back newspapers and such, but she clearly indicates that there was harassment, which was going on for some time, which is why when this final straw happened and the media got hold of the story, she was done. She couldn't take it anymore. So there was clearly quite an intensive buildup. Was it just between her and one other faculty member? It's really hard to say, but it did seem like, maybe like in your situation, where there was an organizational movement against her by that point. So how exactly it started? Was it a rivalry between just two people, or was it that the department wanted to go in a different direction and needed to let her go? I'm not quite sure exactly what the nature of that was. I don't know if I can find that out either, unfortunately, but it would be good to try and fill in these cases. There's one case that happened at UVA fairly recently where a bully was named Ted Genoways, and they named him a bully because there was a suicide by one of his coworkers who had had all the symptoms of basically scapegoating, actually. I call it a scapegoating, not a bullying. Because it was a systemic issue coming not just from Ted, but from the greater organization that was also putting pressures on Ted, budget cutting, telling him his journal might be shut down, things like that. So it was organizational. But there was a documentary made about it a few years later. And was it called What Killed Kevin, I believe? And then I wrote about it because I found it to be such an interesting misuse of the term bullying. So this is a scapegoating, this is not a bullying. But the documentary brings out all of the different perspectives that actually make you really wonder what on earth was the truth here. It shows the competing narratives so beautifully and horribly, but clearly that it's really, really well done. And that might be.
Yeah, is this on?
It's on.
Okay, so I think what you're doing is extremely important, and I think the place where you can make a difference is there is a ton of research on bullying. There's lots of persons who do training on it. My institution does training for all administrators on what bullying is, how to recognize, how to intervene. And there's lots of literature, programs, software programs you buy and you bring to campus, et cetera. And that plays to Anne's point of visualizing this as an interaction between two people. Okay, I don't think you should get into that conversation at all, because what is not being addressed in organizations is what your pattern is, which there is a crisis, there's a systemic issue. And in a system, there will be bullies, but that's not what the narrative of scapegoating is doing. And so with this case, it wasn't ever about individuals. I mean, I don't know what it is, but the classic issues at a research institution is someone comes in, they get a huge amount of money for a startup for their lab. All the labs are competing for the money. They're competing for the grad students. It's a dog-eat-dog world. The dean comes down and says, your unit is not producing enough research. We're going to give the next position to this other department. And so that's at the R1s. At lower level universities, there's sudden changes in standards for tenure and promotion. And someone who's doing a lot more research and someone else is going to get tenure, and other people who thought they were safe are not. And so what the training needs to be is to go into an organization, whether it's a university or a company, and say, what's been going on the last 2 years? What are points of tension, stress? And you find out what are the money issues, what are the issues with organizational identity, all of that stuff. And that explains as your pattern at some point, that is going to, if there is going to be scapegoating, it's going to crystallize, as you say, on an individual who's going to be the cause of it all. So I think the bullying narrative loses your distinctive voice because organizations are not doing scapegoat training.
No, they're
and
not.
they really should be doing it because not everything is bullying.
Correct.
Bullying is on the one-on-one or maybe two-on-one, but it's caused by personality issues of bullies. It's not caused by a systemic issue in an organization that leads to systemic conflict that leads to scapegoat. And so if you go back to the first pages of Girard's A Scapegoat, and he's doing the Machaut story, it's not individual people. There was a time of crisis.
Right.
People were dying, and there was the plague, and all of a sudden, persons figure out who is the cause of this. You start with this institutional crisis, and then you come in and you say, I can help you, because you've got a scapegoat here somewhere. So that's
absolutely on the mark, Marty. On the mark. Yeah, this is very distinct from bullying, which is why I do like to start with that, definition and how it does not address the same issue at all. Yeah.
Now, the conversation can continue over wine and cheese, and we also do have a reservation for 6:30 at Rogers Pier. Just a few blocks north of here, to which you're all invited, please. But first, please join me in thanking our speakers.